государственной поддержки, кто имеет право на государственную поддержку, каковы критерии отнесения различных категорий сельхозтоваропроизводителей к бюджетополучателям, кто вообще имеет право получать эти средства, какие категории хозяйств получают приоритетную поддержку, учитывая, что аграрная структура весьма неоднородна, какими показателями измеряется эффективность бюджетной поддержки сельского хозяйства, как определить влияние тех или других направлений и мер аграрной политики на сельское хозяйство, благосостояние производителей и потребителей продукции и, конечно, на развитие сельских территорий. Наконец, как формируется сам аграрный бюджет? Что здесь, какие принципы здесь действуют? Исторический принцип или государство закладывает определенные средства поддержки, исходя из формулируемых их целей, или, может быть, бюджетная поддержка выделяется за счет лоббирующих групп. Все эти вопросы очень интересны, и мы благодарны нашим немецким коллегам и за совместный проект, который начался в этом году, это трехлетний проект, и за этот семинар, который, я надеюсь, принесет нам обоюдную пользу. Все, что я хотел сказать вначале, я хотел теперь предоставить слово профессору Херцфельду, руководителю ЯМА. Пожалуйста.
Спасибо. Уважаемые дамы и господа, дорогие коллеги из разных научно-исследовательных институтов и университетов, для меня является большой честью и радостью приветствовать вас от имени организаторов из Leibniza Института аграрного развития в странах с переходной экономикой. Несмотря на многолетний обмен и сотрудничество в СВЯПе, насколько мне известно, это первый совместно организованный семинар. Вопросы сельскохозяйственной политики и последствия, а также объяснения и существования и развития имеют решающее значение для развития аграрного сектора как в России, так и в Еврейском Союзе. Теоретически и эмпирически обоснование исследования направлены на то, чтобы указывать на потенциал для улучшения и поддерживать обоснование политические решения. Я желаю всем участникам сегодняшнего семинара плодотворной и вдохновляющей дискуссии. Надеюсь, чтобы наше совместное мероприятие становилось новым элементом укрепления сотрудничества между нашими российскими партнерскими институтами и ЯМО. Спасибо.
Большое спасибо, Томас, за ваше приветствие, за ваши слова. И разрешите представить слово Василию Квартюку, который является куратором проекта. Пожалуйста.
Всем доброе утро, меня зовут Василий Квартюк. Спасибо большое за представление. Я представляю оргкомитет со стороны ЯМО, но с другой стороны я хочу также отметить очень большой вклад, естественно, со стороны VIP, и вот человек, который со мной тоже очень сильно работал, это Санджи Васильевич. Вот он здесь тоже, спасибо большое за поддержку. Я просто пару слов буквально по поводу вот таких вот моментов технических, скажем так, да, то есть, во-первых, вы уже, наверное, видели, что у нас есть синхронный перевод, то есть очень важно иметь наушники, тоже те, кому нужно перевод с английского на русский, наушники можно найти вот здесь вот снаружи. Ну и другая важная деталь — это кофе-брейки. Кофе-брейки, насколько я понял, они будут здесь вот слева, ну и по расписанию, да, то есть вот, чтобы люди много не искали, вот здесь вот они будут организованы. Я хотел бы немножко вот пару слов тоже по поводу нашей сегодняшней работы сказать, по поводу регламента. У нас формат мероприятия как такой, можно сказать, семинар, да, то есть более мы хотели организовать такое неформальное общение по поводу вот тех тем, которые нас интересуют. Планировали мы 40 минут на одну презентацию, то есть треть времени выделяется на презентацию и треть времени на дискуссию. То есть мы хотим очень такую живую дискуссию, хотели бы, чтобы вы тоже активно включались в разговор. Да, то есть мы вас приглашаем, да, и будем пытаться тоже каким-то образом вас привлекать. Поэтому все, кто презентует, пожалуйста, были бы благодарны, если бы вы оставались в рамках 25-30 минут, где-то вот так. И последнее, то, что я хотел сказать, то, что у нас такое небольшое нововведение, да, то есть это у нас будет панельная дискуссия в конце нашего семинара, это будет без 15:04, такой интересный формат, где у нас будет панель очень интересных спикеров, и здесь мы предоставим намного больше возможностей аудитории тоже поучаствовать в обсуждении, да, где можно задать вопросы, обсудить некоторые вопросы и так далее. На данном этапе спасибо за внимание, не буду больше забирать времени, и можем начать наш семинар. Спасибо.
Спасибо, Василий. Уважаемые коллеги, разрешите предоставить слово профессору Томасу Херцфельду. Вы так замечательно говорили по-русски, вступительное слово. Наверное, доклад будете делать на английском языке, да? Пожалуйста, там будет удобно.
I apologize that I will not continue to speak in Russian, though my Russian is not as good as I pretended that it will be. You allow that I start my presentation with a very brief introduction of YAMO, as I expect that the Institute is not as known as, well known as we are, of course. Though you find some folders, some leaflets with some more information at the registration desk. It's in Russian language. Though it gives you also the contact details in case you would like to have more information, you would like to access publications, or you would like to contact any of our colleagues. The Institute has been founded in 1994 slightly after the reunification of East and West Germany, and it should support initially the German government in exploring questions regarding agrarian reforms in the neighboring countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Nowadays, its research area expanded towards East, and also the size of the Institute expanded. Now we have approximately 110 colleagues, among them approximately 80 scientists. The other are working in the administrative department and student assistants. We are a very international environment, so we have colleagues from approximately 20 different nations, and we have a budget of 5 million euro per year, which is comparatively, compared to other agriculture economics institutes in Germany and other Leibniz institutes, it's a rather small institute, I have to admit. As I mentioned, the YAMO is a member of the Leibniz Association, which is an association of 90 scientific institutes from various scientific disciplines across Germany. It's jointly funded by the German federal government and the federal states of Germany. And the institutes are working in the disciplines of economics, agriculture economics, as the YAMO is the only one in this field, natural sciences, educational sciences, and other disciplines. YAMO is engaged in two local networks in the area Halle-Leipzig, which is called Leibniz Science Campus. One is the Leibniz Science Campus on plant-based bioeconomy, which has a more interdisciplinary focus towards natural sciences and looks at the new potentials of agriculture production for also industrial uses. And the other science campus, the other network, extends more towards Leipzig. It's an interdisciplinary network of political scientists, geographers and economists and other institutes, also in anthropology, looking at Eastern Europe global challenges. I already mentioned the tasks of IAMO that has been founded to do research, of course, in the agricultural development and development of rural areas in the formerly centrally planned economies. As a second task, it should advise and it should support stakeholders in the field of policy making and also in business in providing insights, results from research. And the third task is to engage in the qualification of young researchers, especially from the countries where we do research, and this takes different forms that PhD students, mainly PhD students, come to IAMO and stay for a period of time or a full time of their PhD thesis at IAMO, or we provide summer schools and seminars in various countries where we do research. Though I mentioned that the area covers all formerly centrally planned economies of Europe and Asia, and we strongly believe that there are still peculiarities and single characteristics in those countries determined partly by the history and by the past, which justifies a special approach, a special research questions, and which can be in parts contrasted with the other countries of the European Union which did not share the same past. Therefore, we stick to this research focus covering these European and East Asian countries. IAMO consists of 3 scientific departments engaging in agriculture policy analysis, analysis of agriculture markets and world trade, and structural change of agriculture farms and enterprises and in rural areas, which is supported by an administrative department where we center all services like library and IT and other services for the institute as such. The research, of course, is very diverse, and I will not speak about every research project we do in IAMO, but we try to communicate them with clustering them around 5 research domains, which should represent the major research foci of the Institute. And these 5 research domains cover areas like analysis of policies and institutions, working analysis of contracts and other institutional aspects, the analysis of land use changes and the use of water resources and irrigation in agriculture, the analysis of livelihoods in rural areas, exploration of the development of poverty, well-being in rural areas, and development of alternative income sources for rural households. 4th, questions focusing on the organization of agriculture enterprises and agricultural farms, the use of labor incentives, and other questions in this field. And finally, the 5th research domain centers on questions looking at the coordination of agricultural value chains, which is of special interest, of course, to various countries in Europe as well as beyond. So far, the short introduction to the Institute. I would like now to start with my presentation as indicated on the program. And this presentation has the major aim to underline or to provide you, to convince you of a thesis that a comprehensive analysis of agricultural policies needs to look at its effects of the policies on agricultural producers and agriculture sector, or broader spoken on rural areas, as well as the determinants of the existence of those policies. So I would claim that we need to enlarge the window of our toolbox analyzing agricultural policies and should look beyond our core standard agriculture economics discipline and try to incorporate also findings from political sciences and political economics as they emerged over the 70s and 80s in the literature. I would like to fulfill this claim or to support this thesis by providing 2 perspectives, or explaining more details of the 2 perspectives on policy analysis, illustrating this with examples of the European Union's dairy quota policy, explaining its emergence, and also factors why it lasted for so long. And I will give a very brief outlook on our research project called Fed Agricole, which has been already mentioned in the introductory statement, and later on presentations of colleagues from IAMO will illustrate already preliminary findings and the way we want to go in this direction. So if you look at this graph, which I borrowed from Rauser and colleagues, we know that the standard agricultural economics literature looks very much at the policy incidence. So it looks at the effects of agricultural policies, might it be subsidies, might it be quotas, might it be import tariffs or export subsidies, on economic consequences, on prices, on marketed quantities or non-marketed quantities, on set-aside and other factors. Development of farms subsequent due to these policies. So that's the major, I think, well-known, accepted perspective. However, we have to take into account that policies have, or the economic effects of policies can have feedback effects on the development of new policies, on reforms of existing policies. And this is governed or influenced by the influence of the different stakeholders in the economic sector. So there's a feedback effect from the economic sector on policy making, and this drives or constrains the development of the selection of new policy instruments, and again there's a feedback effect how policies will be implemented, and then the circle closes. I will, in the first part of this talk, look at this part of the graph and illustrates this, and later on I will look at the upper part of this graph. So, as I already mentioned, the analysis of policy incidence is well established in the literature, and we have famous examples from scholars in the late 50s, to more than 50 years ago, which established the empirically grounded analysis of policies. And the objectives, I think you know best your own objectives from your own research, are the identification of winners and losers of certain policies, and how much consumers or producers gain from reforms, from prices or liberalization measures. Agriculture economics did a lot of research in quantifying welfare changes, in comparing the welfare changes, identifying the net debt losses of a society. They provided support to order different alternative policy options depending on the costs on society. There's a big literature on quantification of economic consequences on growth and trade, especially accompanying the negotiations in the global area about trade liberalizations in the late 80s, early 90s. And of course, equity considerations play a big role in those type of analysis. The methodological toolbox, I expect it's also quite known, covers a broad range, ranging from starting from microeconometric analysis, looking at farm household data or farm level data, analyzing effects on input use, on output decisions, depending on certain policies, on certain quotas and other policy measures. Partial equilibrium models are also well known and established, looking at distributional effects within the agriculture sector, and of course we can extend the scale at the global level. We have famous global level general equilibrium models like GTEP, which aims at quantifying welfare effects of international liberalization measures or international effects of changes in, for instance, trade policies and other policies. There is generally accepted the evidence that substantial welfare losses have occurred due to protection and subsidies of the agriculture sector. Especially the EU has been attacked, so to say, from international partners in distorting world agriculture trade, and that's led also to liberalization of the common agriculture policy of the European Union over the last decennium. Of course, that field is not closed, and I still see challenges ahead. And at least from my personally subjective perspective, I see some or a lot of potential in looking deeper at distributional distribution effects of certain policies within the agriculture sector or within rural areas, we know that agriculture producers might be very diverse, from small households to really big enterprises, and that contrast is even larger in the formerly centrally planned economies as in the traditional old Western European community. The agriculture sector was much more homogeneous. But that implies that agriculture policies, subsidies, and tariffs or export bans might have different effects on small farms and big farms, depending on their integration in markets, depending on their degree of commercialization and their use of bought inputs and so forth. Therefore, these effects might be much better analyzed and understood and explained to policymakers. The second challenge I would like to mention here, it's not a conclusive list, is motivated by the ongoing global discussions about policies to reduce the environmental impacts of agricultural production, and I see that agriculture producers face increasingly the pressure to justify nitrate emissions, phosphorus emissions, leakage to groundwater, and methane emissions to the society, and that increasing pressure to reduce those emissions. On the other hand, especially in the European Union, policymakers claim that, representatives of interest groups claim that agriculture justifies additional support because agriculture provides public goods. However, our standard tools to measure public goods, to quantify the monetary value of public goods is very limited, and therefore I see a lot of potential in doing research in this in order to provide good decision basis in how far public goods provide benefits and what are the costs which can outweigh or which might be justified to outweigh those benefits. Let's look a little bit deeper on a specific example of the European dairy market in the late 1970s. Though the European Union, European Commission introduced intervention prices and to stimulate the production of cow milk in the late 60s, early 70s, and agriculture producers responded successfully. Though they increased dairy production substantially, which led over less than 10 years period to oversupply of milk for the European market. And in common language, people spoke of milk lakes and butter mountains which have been stored in intervention storages and which had to be exported on third country markets using export subsidies because the EU price was not competitive on export markets. These intervention storages and export subsidies were costly, and they had to be financed from the EU budget, from taxpayers indirectly. And additionally, the European Commission tried to subsidize consumption of milk, for instance, the school milk program or other programs to increase internal demand for those products. Early non-marketing schemes which aimed at decreasing the size of dairy cows in the European Union in the late 60s, early 70s were not as successful as expected. Therefore, the European Commission had to develop different instruments in order to limit at least the growth of future production. If we use an established perspective on this policy decision dilemma, we can look at just an example, two different instruments. So we could look at a target price as an instrument, tea or a dairy quota as an alternative instrument. And positive agriculture economics provides us with insights into the welfare effects of those instruments. So we know if the target price will be introduced, that means consumers pay price, a market price PC, producers receive a target price PT, and the difference will be given as a direct payment, as a direct subsidy, then the welfare loss will be this triangle K. If you compare this with the dairy quota, we know that both consumers pay the price PQ and producers receive the price PQ. That means the welfare loss will be the area I, J, and K. So we can compare the welfare effects, the costs for a society based on those positive agriculture economic theories. And we can assume that we can rank or we can show the different welfare outcomes in this graph, and we can also compare different mixtures of both instruments. However, our normal or positive agricultural economic theory and literature is limited in explaining why politicians opt for certain policies. So this graph, or those graphs, cannot tell us why the European Commission decided to introduce a quota instead of other instruments. So the dairy quota has been introduced in 1984 for milk deliveries to dairies and direct sales for milk. There has been a fine, so-called super levy. If farmers delivered more milk, then they had quotas. And the transfer of quotas across farmers within one member state was in the beginning quite restrictive. And even at the end of this quota policy, it was not possible to transfer dairy quotas across member states. So any trade was just limited to the specific member state. And the subsidies for consumption still continued, and there's still now a small budget for school milk program. Who paid the costs of this policy? So if we assume that this producer single commodity transfer calculated by the OECD measures the right costs of this policy, we see that farmers received annually transfers between 15 and 20 billion euro per year. Only dairy producers and consumers and taxpayers had to carry the burden of between 10 and also 20 billion euros. This graph is somewhat misleading, as with the introduction of the decoupling of this policy, or decoupling of direct payments and the declining tariff rates for dairy products, and the phasing out of export subsidies, this direct commodity transfer declines, as indicated in this graph, around the years 2005, 2006, 2007. However, you have to add the single farm payment, the decoupled payment, which still represents a major monetary budget, but which cannot be directly linked to dairy production of farmers anymore. So there's only the actual dairy production is not directly coupled to the farm payment or the direct payment a farmer receives nowadays. Therefore, this part is missing in this graph if you just look at the single commodity transfer. Though I think this graph showed that costs have been carried to a large extent by consumers and taxpayers. There are additional negative effects of this policy illustrated by researchers. We can talk about a fossilization of agricultural production structures in the dairy sector. And Whittle-Jongeneel, just to mention one example, showed empirically that the entry barriers for the costs for dairy quota in order to extend dairy production on an existing farm or for new farmers entering dairy production have been substantial. On the other hand, less efficient farms are still motivated to stay in the sector and will not leave the sector because they can extract those quota rents, so they can extract benefits from this quota. The negative effects on trade partners, I already mentioned that the European Union has been had substantial exports on dairy markets, butter and milk powder and cheese on the world market, which tended to lower world market prices. And this instrument, initially thought to last until the early 90s, so less than 10 years, has been extended and extended and extended until spring 2015, though it took much longer to reform this policy again than expected initially in the early 80s. Though I already mentioned open questions, so we don't know exactly from our positive theory why a government chooses a certain policy, why it is implemented in a certain way, and we cannot say how will be the reaction of consumers to this costs of the policy and the producers who benefit from this policy. Therefore, we should look, or we need to look at this upper part of this graph. We should look at these feedback effects of the economic consequences on the governance structures and the development, the negotiation of the policy field, on the development of new policies or the stability of existing policies. Therefore, we have to endogenize policy formation in those theories, and there are a number of papers and scholars engaging in research in this, especially in the 70s and 80s, called public choice literature, which looked at unintended and intended consequences due to the implementation, who benefited from certain policies, from certain restrictions, who extracted rents which occurred, what is the role of asymmetric information, incentive compatibility, and how credible are commitments made by the beneficiaries of policies, interest groups, and the politicians. And of course, what are the effects of actions of interest groups, lobby groups, or single actors on the development and implementation of policies. So this literature, again, just examples, looks at or aims at analyzing the existence and reform processes of agricultural policies, or alternatively looks at the organization and stability of interest groups, to why certain farmers in certain agriculture sectors, for instance in dairy, formed quite powerful interest groups. So we have farmers group organizations just for dairy producers in Germany, for instance, and at European level, but we don't have lobby groups for apple producers or other agriculture sectors. And what are the reasons behind this? Of course, in order to do such an analysis, we have to look at the political structure. And we know that there's a government, and this government could be for a single layer, or in the European Union or Russian Federation, we speak of a multi-layer system, that there's a central decision authority and a lower level decision authority, and they negotiate how certain policies will be developed and how they will be implemented, or the lower level, like the EU member states, have some discretionary power to how to implement policies. So we observed that with the last reform, that the member states took the freedom and used the freedom to implement certain exceptions, certain coupled payments, or implement the direct payment scheme in a different way. And one presentation later this afternoon will take a closer look on this. We have to look at the consumers, taxpayers, and often they don't find a way to organize and to lobby for lower food prices or for lower tax burden. However, we observe that consumers start to organize much more in the past and lobby for environmental aspects. They lobby for farm animal welfare aspects, or for GMO, against GMO technique in agricultural production processes. So there might be specific topics which attract consumers' interest and which they start to form interest groups, and other areas are less attractive for such activities. And finally, we have importers, exporters, which have to be taken into account. And if you look back at the export ban for Russian wheat over the past years, I think you know better than me what is the role of interest groups in negotiating, implementing such export restrictions. So from the literature, there are a number of findings, explanations why inefficient policies exist over time, and one prominent thesis claim from de Gotta and Searle states that in sectors which are relatively declining over the overall economic development, and especially agriculture is a prime example of this, there's a bigger pressure to lobby for support and to claim that we are a shrinking sector and therefore we need more support compared to sectors which are growing. There's an imperfect information, of course, and the costs of this dairy quota and the transfers to dairy producers might be known to experts and people who read those reports published by the OECD, or other agricultural economists, but it's not known to the general public. It's not known to voters. Therefore, it will not play any role in any voting campaign or any broader public debate. Therefore, the costs of the policy are somewhere hidden, and there's an information asymmetry about this. However, the benefits for farmers is directly visible, though the dairy producers directly see what they get in terms of direct payments or high milk prices. The discussion about land price development in Germany and whether it's useful to implement policy instruments to restrict the increase of land prices illustrates that the deadweight costs of different policy instruments are not always rightly assigned to the right policy instrument which causes this deadweight cost. Though the land prices increase due to direct payments, due to other effects, and not necessarily due to the concentration of farmers, and which has been used as a main argument to justify restrictions on the price formation on land markets. And finally, there is a commitment problem, which is, I think, obvious, that in policies represent have an intertemporal nature, that once governments have been elected for a certain time, they develop policies, and voters cannot punish politicians later on if they develop policies in a different way than they proposed or claimed during the voting process, and vice versa. If voters voted for a certain politician, and then politicians cannot penalize or punish voters several years later if the voters withdraw their support for this certain position they would have been in favor some years before. So that's this commitment problem which plays also an important role. So let's look at the next example of the dairy policy. So I mentioned the lack of visibility of transfers and costs of policy, which worked in favor of stabilizing this policy regime. Dairy farmers and quota owners have been very active and very successful in lobbying for extensions of this policy, though they wanted to protect the quota grant. And David Harvey, for instance, illustrated the past dependency element in this policy, that the more benefits from the policy embedded in the sector's cost structure, the higher the resistance to change. So he showed that in New Zealand, policies have been younger, have been less longer in place, and therefore it was easier to achieve reforms of dairy policy in New Zealand than in the European Union, because in the European Union the producers already expected that this policy will be in place much longer, and therefore they developed higher resistance to any changes. And the discounting of costs and benefits is very, very difficult. Though you could imagine that policy or the European Commission suggests to pay a lump sum payment for farmers, which takes into account all the benefits of the direct payment over the next 10-year period. So that will be a high lump sum transfer in 1 year. And society, after 10 years, society will be better off, because the costs of this policy are gone. However, to justify such a big lump sum transfer in 1 year is very, very difficult, because it's very difficult to explain this discounting of future payments into one-time payment. And what's the time? So I want to close with a more differentiated picture. Though now you might have the impression that policy might be always harmful to a society, and Rausser described or differentiated this picture and illustrated that policies could have different effects, and that's important also to have this in mind. Though of course we talk about political economic rent-seeking policies, which provide transfers to special interest groups and act as a response to rent-seeking activities of individual actors or lobby groups. On the other hand, there are potentially productive policies which are which aiming at correcting for market failures, providing public goods, and which in generally increase society's welfare. And we should not forget this, that policies can also provide certain goods which increase welfare of society in general. And here I just want to show you one example, again taken from the OECD, this general services support estimate, which summarizes a number of policies, a number of expenditures in terms of education, of extension services, of infrastructure provision, of quality assurance, of input markets and output markets. And here you see I expressed this payment. OECD does not express it in this ratio, but here I expressed this expenditures on this general services support estimate in terms of the value of agricultural production in order to have a comparability across the EU and the Russian Federation. And you see that this share is 2 to 4, 5, 6%. So very, very few money goes in policies which potentially are beneficial for whole society, and therefore that might be also a role for agriculture economists to point to this imbalance that the majority of expenditures goes to policies which decrease the welfare of the society. Therefore, let me conclude that we have a limited understanding, at least in the classical agriculture economics literature, or it's an increasing awareness that we have to look also at the feedback effects from consequences of policies to the development of new policies. And there are promising applications of this political economic literature and concepts incorporating this in the agriculture economics literature. And as Herbert Giersch coins this term of a public economist, I think the agriculture economists should be aware of this and should raise the awareness of the society to the imbalances and to unwanted developments and consequences of policies. So I already mentioned that we started with a project which aims at explaining the mechanisms in agriculture policy development in so-called multi-layer governance systems or federal systems. This project has been supported by the Leibniz Association, and it will last until early 2019. To 28 member states today, there have been environmental and trade negotiations at international level and strict budgetary constraints that have contributed to reforming the agricultural policy. So this is just a very brief overview of the political economy literature on decision making. Here, just to show it a bit better, you can see the development of agricultural support in the European Union and the changes, the reforms that have taken place. On the one hand, we see a slight decline in the levels of support expressed in percentage of farm revenue, gross farm revenue, and then you can see a change in the composition of support, which mainly took place in the early 1990s after the so-called McSherry reform, where member states decided, or where the EU decided to reduce the market price support, the output support to agriculture and replace that gradually through direct payments, which at the beginning were coupled to production, but then in the 2003 reform that we will look at a bit closer, the EU decided to decouple support, which meant that farmers would receive a per hectare payment independent of how much they produce, and this is this you can see this is a green part which has been growing since.
cases. Now let's look at the national decision making. And there are different political economy strands of literature that look at policy decisions as from a voting model perspective, that put in a very short, concise way. The politicians try to maximize votes and therefore choose policies which either attract have great support from a large amount of voters, or which are targeted as swing voters that are in the end decisive within elections. Then there are interest group models, and these try to explain policies through competition between different interest groups. There are interest groups that are more influential in bringing their interest into the political process, and interest groups which are less influential. There is a large strand of literature that is growing at the moment that looks then at the political institutions, on the framework within which the competition of politicians for votes and the competition between interest groups takes place. And a very specific strand of this is the bureaucracy model that says that administration seeks to increase its resources and influence, and therefore chooses policies that enlarge the competence of the administration. So I will more or less focus on these two approaches. To understand that a bit better, there is quite a diversity across member states. On the one hand, regarding the size and structure of the agricultural sector, but also regarding the organization of agricultural interests, the cultural and historical role of agriculture and state intervention, and in the design of political systems. There's Germany, which is a federal state, and agricultural policy within Germany is a competence of the Länder and not of the Fed. And the federation had rather limited competences in the field of agricultural policy, and there are much more centralized states like France. Then there are differences in the party and electoral system. There are states where interest groups have traditionally been involved in the implementation of policies and into policy advice, and there has been a quite limited set of interest organizations that was involved into this process, and there are more plural states like the UK where there are much more interest groups that compete among each other for access to the political system. And then also the role of the member states in financing of course the European agricultural policy plays a role. There are those who are the net contributors to the EU budget and those who are net beneficiaries. So let's get a brief insight into how these factors played a role in the 2003 reform. The content of negotiations, on the one hand, was a further reduction of market price support, and then a very contentious point was the decoupling of direct payments. There was the redistribution of direct payments among farmers in member states was discussed. Also, the limiting payments for large farms at limiting the total amount of payment that they can receive was discussed. The strengthening of rural development played a role, and cross-compliance, which means linking payments to environmental services provided, to specific management practices, and this was also introduced through this reform. I will focus mostly on the decoupling of direct payments now in the following presentation, which was very contentious among member states. The context of the reform, the EU was in WTO negotiations and wanted them to make some progress in this. then the enlargement was just at the doorstep, and the member states knew once there would be much more member states, they couldn't go on with their current policies, that the budget would explode, that decision making would become much more difficult, and also, they had already decided that the new member states would not directly receive the same direct payments as the old member states, and wouldn't receive payments coupled to production, and then they knew they would have difficulties to justify this difference between the new member states and the old member states. There were budgetary pressures. There had been food crisis, which also some impacts on the public perception of the common agricultural policy, and the Iraq war, according to the literature that I have read, also played a role. At this point, I have to say I had, of course, to rely on secondary literature, and I looked at different case studies for designing this presentation. Preparing this presentation. So let's have a short look at the policy positions in the member states. And there were those who were for a reform, for the reduction in market price support, for budget stabilization and decoupling. This was mainly the UK, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden and Germany. And there were those that were opposed to a reform, and especially to the decoupling of payments. That was France, Ireland and Spain. And then, as I already said, also the discussion on the way that now direct payments should be redistributed among farmers and member states was quite contentious. But there was also a large group of countries that were somewhere in between these dimensions, and to get a majority for the reform, member states had to get them on their side, let's say that this way. But the situation was such that in the beginning Germany positioned itself more on the opposition level to reform, and Swinen explains this in that way, that he says Germany was somehow indebted to France, with which it had a coalition in the Iraq war discussion, saying that it didn't want to participate in the war, and didn't want to break this good working relationship with the French partners. And on the other hand, there was Spain, that was in a coalition with the UK in the Iraq war discussion, and the Commission then asked the UK to just get Spain on their side, and in exchange it promised to the UK government that there would be no limit on direct payments. So with Spain having switched on that side, Germany also switched back, and this is how in the end reform was possible. But of course there were more negotiations on the details, and in the end the reform was much weaker than the Commission proposal in the beginning. It was less radical. Let's have a short look at the implementation. So this is also a way of how often European agricultural policies is then adjusted to member state needs or also wishes, and that they get a choice in implementing the policies. So there was the EU decided to have a decoupling, but it didn't have to be immediate, so the member states had some time in implementing it and could also make some exceptions. And France, consistent with its position in the negotiation, made quite a lot of use of this possibility to exempt some products from the decoupling. And the surprising thing is that Ireland, who was in the beginning against decoupling, then decided, no, in the implementation we don't keep any product coupled, any support coupled to production. Then there were also options in the distribution of direct models, and this is very important for the distribution of money across farms. There was a historical model that means farmers would get payments based on on the support they received in the past, so based on the production that they had in the past. There was a regional model where farmers in the region, regardless of what they produce or have produced in the past, would get the same payment per hectare. And there was a dynamic hybrid, where there was a hybrid model, a mix of both models, and it was dynamic when it was moving towards a regional model in the end, and the static model was choosing just a combination and not moving further towards a regional form of implementation. So you have a picture of what were the issues in the CAP reform, and how did the negotiation go on on the European level. But so far the literature neglects somehow how member states define their positions within negotiations and how they then make decisions on the implementation of policies. On the one hand, here I just provide an overview of characteristics of the agricultural sector, and what you can mainly see from this is that agriculture doesn't play a very big role in any of the states, and also not in the employment. And there is a varying degree of efficiency of agriculture, and you can also see that in many member states there is a mix of farms, small farms and large farms. Only in Spain the small farms have a clear majority in this sample of countries. So this just gives you an overview of the diversity of agriculture and the key characteristics. Then the heterogeneity of the organization of farm interests. So following, in France there were two large peak associations, which were strongly been involved into decision making, into implementation, and into advice of policy groups. That this was quite institutionalized. But due to the increasing heterogeneity of also French agriculture, the government also had to include more and more agricultural specific interests had to take more agricultural specific interests into account. Then there is in the Irish agricultural sector, there's also one strong peak association. There's a separate strong association of milk producers, and there are many small marginal farm groups that have their own organizations and organized protests, road blockages, and had similar actions. In Ireland, these cooperative structures weren't as institutionalized in France, but with the emerging of with Ireland becoming a member of the European Union, where also they wanted to, farmers had to organize their interest at European level, the decision making became much more cooperative. But there was also a lot of localism, so direct contact between farmers and local administrators. In Germany, as I said, the Länder are the main bodies have the largest responsibility in agricultural policy making, and there are regional associations that, however, are also organized at federal level. The heterogeneity of farm interest is large due to the East-West divide, with large cooperative farms in East Germany and more small family farms in West Germany, and also an increasing heterogeneity due to organic farmers, and so also the diversity of production patterns is increasing in Germany. And traditionally there is a cooperative structure in Germany as well that mainly involves the peak associations. And then there is the UK, where there are regional peak associations in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, with quite different interests and also marginal groups, just like in Ireland. Even though UK is characterized normally as a pluralist system, over time it has established some corporatist features in the field of agriculture. Let's look at the voters in 2003. So there were several votes in Germany and in France, for example, but also in Ireland. Then the dominant topics were the Iraq War, immigration and Islamization, the Elbe floods, and labor market reforms in the case of Germany. Voters were less interested in agricultural policies, and this didn't play a huge role in the votes in the elections. And in Ireland and the UK, the governing parties had quite stable majority, so they didn't have to worry too much about voters reacting to the agricultural policy, but then these were also not issues in these countries. There were other interest groups in all countries. The manufacturing and service industries have become involved into the agricultural policy due to the WTO negotiations. That was especially important for Germany as an export country, a strong exporter in the UK. And also environmental and consumer groups have become more involved, and especially also in Germany and UK in the wake of the BSE crisis. So this was before the elections, that the UK had to restructure its agricultural ministry, and in Germany the agricultural minister resigned due to the handling of the BSE crisis. And then here you can see the EU budget dimension at that time. Net contributors were Germany, UK and France, and net beneficiaries Ireland and Spain. I somehow dropped Spain from the other explanations because it would have become more lengthy. But there are some studies from agricultural economists on France that say once you concentrate on the agricultural budget and also look at what consumers in different countries pay for the agricultural policy, France is in the end a beneficiary of the agricultural support system in the EU, at least at that time. And there are different governments. The government in the end shows different strategies. So even though we can see quite a diversity in how agricultural interests are organized in the EU, it's hard to make a direct link to the policy positions. For example, Germany has a cooperative structure, but still then took a pro-reform position, while France, with its structure, then was strongly against the reform. And also one have to look, why do the different associations take a specific position. I didn't go that deep into this discussion, but then you see that also the federations then in Germany had to deal with this larger heterogeneity of interest than in France. but in the end, also the way the politicians behaved, the way they dealt with the agricultural interests, that was different. So French was playing a power play at the EU level. They had always been anti-reform and even tried beforehand to change the commissioner who was supporting reform attempts, and it decided to play with the traditional players and not with the new farmers entering with the new farm groups that somehow had different interests than the traditional players who received much support from the old agricultural policy in the EU. In Ireland, the government decided to make a broad consultation, so it invited all kinds of farmers and looked at and discussed with them how do we look at production in the future. It did a lot of scientific advice, and so there was a very broad consultation, which is more characteristic normally for a pluralist system. And in Germany, the ministry had to carefully balance interests, so it decided for it decided, for example, to take a position against limits, which would have harmed the East German sector, but then looked at more and compensation of environmental services that served the small farm sector. And in the UK, the government more focused on the liberal principles, the UK government, but then responsibility on how to decide on the specific implementation was delegated to the regions that had different interests. So the conflict at national level was avoided. So there's no straightforward conclusion that we would have from an econometric model, and we in the Fed Agricultural project we try to also develop econometric models that explain differences in the level of support and the composition of support between member states. But the data work is quite time consuming, so that we don't have a clear good data set yet for this analysis. But for your understanding of the agricultural policy in the EU, it's important to see that radical reform is quite unlikely because of the multiple layers and multiple players at the different levels that somehow have to find a conclusion that will be accepted by citizens in all member states and interest groups in all member states. There's also an increasing heterogeneity which affects in the farm sector, which affects policy making at the national and the EU level, and the political traditions and strategies of member states play quite some role. Also the international level with food crisis and WTO negotiations also occurring at international level also affect EU and national negotiations. Okay, this is the literature that I based my qualitative presentation on. And I'm open for questions.
Спасибо большое за очень интересный доклад. Я позволю себе один вопрос. Вы так много говорили о различиях разных стран и политических партий. что вообще, мне кажется, что вот единая политика в Европе невозможна, а тем не менее она существует. Вот почему существует все-таки единая политика в Европе, несмотря на все различия? Потому что это что, такой консенсус негласный в обществе, что сельское хозяйство – это важная отрасль, что надо поддерживать жизнь в сельской местности. Вот такой, может быть, неформализованный консенсус. Или в чем-то другие причины. Исторически, просто на определенном этапе сформировали единую политику, которая всех устраивает. Почему несмотря на все дискуссии, на все многообразие подходов, все-таки мы говорим о единой европейской политике?
Okay.
Спасибо.
Yeah, thanks for the question. There is a unified policy. In the beginning, it started as a market policy when the EU formed its internal market. And this is why there are very important competition rules across and limits in how market support can be provided to farmers. And I think it's very important, and there's quite a consensus that this also has to be maintained for the future. Structure, the internal market also creates some frictions in the agricultural sector, and this is why the EU then introduced a common structural policy. So, and I think there is indeed a consensus on that it's important to support rural areas, and that it's also important to support the provision of environmental service, for example, in the agricultural sector, and that this should be encouraged also by European level, but on the extent and way this should be done, there's of course no consensus. And this is why I introduced it at the beginning, that there's a manual approach in this area of the agricultural policy, and this is also increasingly applied to the direct payments, which means that member states have the ability to somehow adjust their policies to the national context, and in the meantime to have common policy priorities at the European level. But indeed, there are sometimes discussions on maybe the common agriculture should be scrapped, but I don't think that this is really a way in the future.
Спасибо. Пожалуйста, вопросы.
Спасибо за презентацию, Елена Григорьева. Яна, вы, в принципе, делали доклад в период, это 2003 год. Сейчас программа новая, 2014-2020 год принята. В принципе, идея, наверное, остаются те же, но я не говорю там Брексит, отмена квот и так далее. То есть вот ваше ощущение, это то же самое сейчас, или как сказать, разница между тем, чем было, подходы те же самые, к самой политике формулированию были и реализации ее вот в новой программе.
Well, so I think the main features that I tried to illustrate here, they are still there, and also they are even more important. So what I tried to show is that there is a quite complex structure of interest where interests differ across member states, but where they still have to take a common position, and even ministers might not straightly take the position that exists in the national discussion to the European Council, but then also have strategic goals within the European discussions that are not only focused on the agricultural policy issues at hand. Also the interlinkage of the international level, the European level and the national level becomes maybe even stronger when with also being having more international companies in the national sector, but in the same time having the small traditional family farms in the different member states. So and the need to find a consensus and also the bargaining that then takes place, which leads to suboptimal outcomes from an economic perspective, is there and will be there in the future. So the policymaker, when it decides, when it also deals with economic analysis of the policies and has to look at what would be optimal from an economic perspective, also has to take account what is viable in policy making, and how do I shape policies in that way that they go into the right direction in the future. So this is then the more practical implications that you get from this kind of analysis.
Спасибо.
DIP. Будьте добры, скажите, пожалуйста, вот вы говорили о политэкономии поддержки аграрного сектора в ЕС, но ни разу не прозвучало вот этот вот термин экономической эффективности. Скажите, пожалуйста, вот на уровне регионов отдельной страны поддержка аграрного сектора и экономическая эффективность аграрного сектора имеет какую-то связь? То есть поддержка.
In principle, one can say that many of the instruments that are used in the agricultural policy, as explained already by Thomas Herzfeld, there are welfare losses. So when we look at this perspective, and if then many of the policies are not optimal, also at the regional or member state level. But evaluating then to take a more broader economic perspective, also so evaluating the efficiency of policies in terms of rural development, for example, or environmental effects is much more harder. And also there we see that often, even if European policy provides some very good policies, for example, this has been in the debate now in the concerning the greening of the agricultural policy.
Я хотел бы уточнить, речь не идет об эффективности аграрной политики, а речь идет об эффективности аграрного сектора вот, в той или иной стране. То есть, если сектор показывает высокую эффективность, то как, вот, в зависимости от этого, как на это реагирует аграрная политика?
Okay, when you understand efficiency in terms of productivity, then there are of course differences across member states, and often the more productive member states are also more pro-reform. But at least this was also the case in the 2003 reform. But then also there is a huge heterogeneity in the productivity of companies, and what has been a large concern also in Europe, for example in France, is that there is a varying productivity, and there are many small family farms who are maybe not productive, but that are still important for maintaining rural life, for environmental services, for this reason they are supported. But then often, in terms of these products, let's say, in policies that would be efficient in terms of serving biodiversity, for example, member states mostly don't choose the most efficient way of support. And this is the motivation for the kind of analysis that I just presented.
Спасибо. Я понимаю вопрос Константина Григорьевича, Яна. Дело в том, что если вот у нас в России, если, скажем, сельхоз товаропроизводителей определенного региона не выполнили целевых показателей, которые прописываются в соглашении между Министерством сельского хозяйства Российской Федерации и региональным министерством, если регионы не выполнили некоторых целевых показателей, то они на следующий год деньги возвращают назад в федеральный бюджет. А вот в Европе возвращаются деньги, если какой-то... Вообще устанавливаются ли целевые показатели для стран, для регионов, и возвращаются ли деньги назад в бюджет, если там что-то с целевыми показателями произошло? У вас такая практика есть?
So there are target indicators, of course, for every policy, and also for the rural policy, this is evaluated regularly. And then for the next period, when member states have to allocate funds again, and then the Commission checks on how they plan to improve the efficiency and maybe changes their rural development plans. There are practices of returning money to the European level, but these are more linked to where money is really not used for the causes that they were thought for. So, where if they get money, for example, and actually there are also examples it's more about who gets the money in the end, and does the person who gets it in the end fulfill the exercise that the money is given for or not, that decides whether funds are returned, but it doesn't look at how well is the service delivered, let's say it that way.
So may I just clarify this expectation or this view, just to make it clear, that the direct payments in the European Union are paid or understood as compensation for the decrease in intervention prices in the early 90s. And there are no target indicators in terms of production increase. Yeah, there are no, as I understood your question of target indicators, that there should be an increase in grain production, increase in milk production. That does not exist in the European Union, and therefore any return of money from member states to the EU level can only be due to violation of procedures.
Но такие случаи были, вам известны такие случаи? Вам известны такие случаи, когда возвращали деньги? Известны такие случаи?
Да.
Известны?
Да.
Спасибо, спасибо. Коллеги, я прошу прощения за то, что задал такой бюрократический вопрос. Очень интересно сравнить опыт наш европейский. Давайте поаплодируем Яне Никоновским за презентацию. И мы, к сожалению, немножко выбились из графика на 30 минут. Поэтому я...
Интересная программа. У нас еще две презентации сегодня на первом заседании. Да, после кофе-паузы у нас будет очень интересная панельная дискуссия, да, с тремя представителями разных научных институтов. Ну, начнем мы сегодняшнюю дискуссию с вами после обеда с презентацией профессора Василия Узуна. Он является главным научным сотрудником RANFIX, и сегодня он поговорит об ограничении размера субсидий одному сельхозпроизводителю, да, то есть тема, которая уже всплывала, и он нам разъяснит все необходимость, механизмы и последствия. Пожалуйста, Василий Якимович, вам слово.
Спасибо за предоставленную возможность выступить. Я буду говорить по материалам, которые мы, по результатам, которые мы получили в этом году и которые будут еще в отчете Центра агропродовольственной политики за 2017 год и в публикации мы публикуем сразу после отчета. Для выступления, ну, вот есть такой вывод у нас, что главная проблема совершенствования господдержки, повышения ее отдачи, это связано с механизмами распределения господдержки и концентрации ее у очень немногого количества получателей. Значит, я буду говорить как двигается.
Левой кнопкой мышки. Левой кнопкой.
Да. Я буду говорить о недостатках существующей системы господдержки и попытаюсь обосновать, почему необходимо ограничивать субсидии на одного получателя. Короткое обсуждение, как это можно сделать, как эти ограничения можно ввести и что при этом произойдет с субсидиями, как они перераспределятся. Самый главный вопрос, как оценить последствия, если это сделать в реальной политике, не в научных обсуждениях, а вот в реальной жизни. Хотя я очень сильно сомневаюсь, что такую политику Россия примет, что вот такого рода предложения в ближайшее время пройдут. Затем я дам пример расчета влияния предлагаемых изменений в распределении субсидий на рост сельскохозяйственного производства. И в заключении коротко о том, насколько эффективно вот это перераспределение, которое мы предлагаем. Значит, сразу скажу, что речь идет о субсидиях, прямых субсидиях, которые получают сельхозпроизводители. Именно о прямых. Вот те direct payment, о которых говорил предыдущий оратор с этой трибуны. Об остальных речь не идет. Только и при оценке эффекта, вот профессор Светлов уже выступал, он говорил, мы в пределах одной работы это делаем, попытка оценить эффект по его влиянию, по влиянию субсидий на рост производства. Вот есть субсидии, дало ли это какой-нибудь рост производства. Вот с этих позиций. Вот теперь о существующей системе господдержки. Значит, основные ее недостатки. Первое. Сельхозпроизводитель имеет право подать заявку на субсидию, а получит он или не получит. Даже если он соблюдает все требования, которые выставлены законом и нормативно-правовыми актами, гарантии получения этой субсидии нет. Основная часть бюджетных субсидий распределяется между очень ограниченным кругом заявителей. Ну, вот на слайде я привел пример. Есть Брянская мясная компания в составе Мираторга. В прошлом году, в 2016 году, она получила по одной программе только развития мясного скотоводства 33,6 миллиарда субсидируемых кредитов. Это 91% всех денег, которые страна выделила на эти цели. Еще 3 компании были, которые получили остальные 9%. Все. 4 компании на всю программу. Все субсидии ушли, вся остальная страна, все остальные сельхозпроизводители, а их у нас сотни тысяч, не получили ничего. Сельхозпроизводитель никогда, обычный сельхозпроизводитель, на какие субсидии он может рассчитывать? Планируя свою деятельность, он в начале года должен иметь возможность рассчитать, что он получит из бюджета. Ничего он рассчитать не может, потому что ему могут ничего не дать. И уже Александр Васильевич говорил, что основная причина отказа, почему не дают, не те бумаги, которые сотни страниц написаны, инструкции по получению субсидий, а основной отказ – денег нет. Вот в этом году с 1 января субсидируемый кредит, чтобы получить, надо там подать заявку в банк и так далее. Все это собирается в Москве. Из 10 заявителей 7 сразу получают ответ: денег нет. И все. Они затратили деньги на оформление всего этого, кучу времени, получили короткий ответ: денег нет. И на том все заканчивается. Очень сложная система контроля есть за субсидиями. Сельхозпроизводитель, получивший субсидию или получающий субсидию, должен заполнять огромную кипу бумаг систематически, доказывая, что вот он соответствует тем требованиям, которые законодательство. В директивных органах основная задача Минсельхоза и региональных Минсельхозов – это распределение этих денег. Это главная их задача и то, чем они занимаются постоянно. Вот эти деньги делят, контролируют, Это самое главное в их работе. Значит, для того, чтобы сказать, я еще раз хочу проиллюстрировать, как делятся субсидии. Вы видите, я просто из сайта Минсельхоза скачал, вот есть план льготного кредитования заемщиков на 2017 год. Я выбрал только инвестиционные кредиты. Вы видите, как они были распределены. Причем в госпрограмме ни в одном месте такой способ дележа кредитов, субсидий не предусмотрен. Это сделано министерством, что будем субсидировать кредиты там больше 8 миллиардов, от 1 до 8, там до 1. и малый бизнес. Если вы посмотрите просто последнюю графу, 641 миллион субсидий дается для тех, кто будет получать кредиты больше 8 миллиардов. Легко посчитать, что если кто-то получил 8 миллиардов кредитов, при ставке ЦБ 8%, которая компенсируется, эта сумма идет одному. То есть в плане уже предусмотрено, что вот эти деньги пойдут одному получателю. Никто другой на эти деньги рассчитывать не может. Это есть один получатель, на которого все рассчитано. От 1 до 8, если считать эти деньги, которые выделены, это, может быть 4 получателя, может быть больше, 32, но больше 32 точно не может быть. Вот эти две графы охватывают уже 56% всех субсидий. Но понятно, что при таком распределении говорить о том, что, как Василий уже говорил, как это повлияет на избирателей, на их выгоды, как они будут голосовать. Ничего эти избиратели не получат. Эти деньги получают конкретные собственники в огромных масштабах. И все. Не влияние на избирательную кампанию, на словах может быть, но по сути, я не вижу. Я не вижу, что это как-то влияет на население, если отдается единицам. Сколько-то единиц людей компании получают это. Почему нужно вводить ограничения на размер субсидий на одного получателя? Если их не вводить, есть система нынешняя, мы видим как это. Почему нужно вводить? Первый довод, который я привожу, если один получает огромные субсидии и возможность действовать на этом поле, он получает явные, эксклюзивные преимущества на рынке. Ему дало государство эти преимущества. Он получает, он развивается, все остальные, малый бизнес, все прочие, разоряются и покидают рынок. Они не конкурентны здесь. Причем раньше, в других работах я уже приводил, что это противоречит закону о конкуренции, духу закона о конкуренции, российскому закону, потому что там написано четко, что государство своими субсидиями не должно создавать конкурентное преимущество для отдельных производителей. Не должно. Но есть оговорка. Но если это предусмотрено в каких-нибудь целевых программах и так далее, то тогда можно. В данном случае это госпрограмма, целевая программа. Значит, видимо, законодатели считают, что это допустимо. Но есть теория господдержки. Вообще сегодня так много теоретических работ было, очень интересных, очень хороших докладов, но я думал, что кто-то вспомнит о том, что есть теория господдержки. В учебниках написано, почему надо поддерживать фермера, этого бедного фермера, потому что и перечислены все факторы, из-за которых те, кто получают основные субсидии, они никак не подходят под эту теорию. Они не являются маленькими, они не являются бедными. Вообще ни с какой стороны они не подходят. Но они получают эти субсидии. Есть довод, что крупные проекты, а эти деньги идут на очень крупные проекты, что крупные проекты должны осуществляться инвесторами. Инвесторы выделяют деньги. Есть исполнитель, он получает их. Инвесторы контролируют шаг за шагом, как деньги расходуются, пытаются добиться эффективности. А здесь инвестор получает дармовые деньги. Просто дармовые деньги, вкладывает их. Если не будет эффективно, озарится он. На чужих деньгах. Контроля нет, а нужен контроль. Большой инвестор, над ним должны висеть тех, кто выделил ему деньги. А в данном случае над ним чиновники, которые не в состоянии вообще к нему подойти даже. Но и еще один довод – это то, что вот мы все время говорим уже много лет о том, что есть контрактное сельское хозяйство, во многих странах оно развито. Это когда крупный бизнес работает по контрактам с малым бизнесом. Вот если деньги даются крупному бизнесу напрямую, он так работать не будет. Если крупному бизнесу деньги не дать и сказать, что мы даем малым, а вы с ним работаете, вы работаете с этим малым бизнесом по контрактам, тогда контрактное сельское хозяйство будет иметь место. В России оно не имеет места. И последнее, в законодательстве, я скажу многих, потому что я не могу сказать всех, но мне кажется, что всех, но я говорю многих, тех, которых мы смотрели. Обязательно есть пункты, нормы законов, которые ограничивают получение субсидий в 1 рубль. В российском большом законодательстве нет ни слова об этом. Вообще никакого. Так, я сказал, могу это проиллюстрировать. Да, вот это, я вернусь к этой иллюстрации дальше. Вообще в России существует мнение, что основные субсидии сельхозпроизводители получают крупные сельхозпроизводители не только в России, но и во всех странах. Это очень устойчивое клише такое. У всех так. Что вы, против чего вы выступаете? Значит, я вот привел на слайде, что, ну да, это правда, но мера, как это делается. Вот видите, 10% выручки дают у нас 15 хозяйств. Все 15 получают субсидии. В США 466. Из них только 76 получают субсидии. Причем количество полученных субсидий у них 0,0%. То есть это ничтожно мало. Они что-то получили, но это ничтожно мало. В России это достаточно ощутимо. Если взять 25% товарной продукции, в России опять 101 хозяйство и все получают субсидии. В Соединенных Штатах далеко не все получают субсидии, и если у нас на эти хозяйства тратится 16% всех субсидий, в США 1%. Но с ростом доли в выручке набора хозяйств ситуация немножко меняется. Но просто я хочу сказать, что правило, что крупнейшие хозяйства получают очень много субсидий, неверно. Это у нас так, но у других это не так. Теперь вот несколько показателей, характеризующих, как это было во времени. Мы видим, что во времени концентрация субсидий, коэффициент Джини, то есть распределение субсидий, 10%, ну вот по децильным группам, но коэффициент Джини рос, вот он устойчиво растет. То есть концентрация субсидий, все меньшее количество, все меньшая доля хозяйств их получают. Причем вот в этих же хозяйствах валовой продукции производится существенно меньше, чем они получают субсидий. Но красочное изображение, кривая Лоренца, распределение субсидий по хозяйствам. Мы видим, что если говорить о 10% децильной группы верхней, 10% хозяйств, они получают 80% субсидий. Но самое интересное здесь, если взять 1% хозяйств, то они уже получают больше половины субсидий. То есть, и по годам эта концентрация субсидий в отдельных хозяйствах растет, как вы видите. Значит, пытались мы сравнить вот ограничения на субсидии у нас и в других странах. Уже Александр Васильевич говорил, в Соединенных Штатах по закону 2014 года, значит, те, кто имеет выручку больше 900 тысяч долларов, не имеют права на бюджетные субсидии. Все остальные могут получать субсидии, но не больше, чем 125 тысяч долларов на одну ферму. Ну, есть какие-то отмены. В ЕС, вот Александр Васильевич сказал, что у них нет ограничений. Как я понимаю законодательство ЕС, все-таки в ЕС есть общее ограничение. 150 тысяч евро на одну ферму. И если больше, то субсидии надо сокращать. Но страны не договорились между собой, что вот это будет действовать. Есть противники этого, общей договоренности нет.